Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubkov. Today we're going to speak about Scottish politics, what's going on in Scotland, and we also touch some scandals, some controversial decisions in Scotland, and we want to go through the politics so we can better understand Scotland. My guest today is Andrew Liddle. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Martin. Nice to see you.
Andrew is a writer, is political analyst, but also a very good researcher. He writes for The Courier, which is a Scottish newspaper, and also Andrew published two books. The first book was published in 2018. It's called Rue Davidson and the Resurgence of the Scottish Tories. And the second book was published in 2022, and it's called Cheers, Mr. Churchill, Winston in Scotland. Both books receive fantastic reviews, and I'm very happy to have Andrew on the show. And I think we can start with a little bit of background of the Scottish politics, so my students and the international audience can better understand Scotland and Scottish politics. So how would you describe the landscape, the political landscape of Scotland, when we're speaking about year 2014, when you had a Scottish referendum for independence? So what has changed since that time, and what can we see in Scottish politics?
Well, Martin, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And you're absolutely right, I think, to focus in on 2014. It's clearly the kind of the hinge moment, the pivot point, I think, in certainly modern Scottish politics. I think if we think about the pre kind of 2014 age, that was very much an age of what I would think of as sort of conventional party politics. You had the Labour Party as the kind of social democratic centre-left party. You had the Conservative Party as the sort of the Christian Democrat or centre-right party. You had the Liberals as the kind of centrist party. This is slightly simplistic, but this is the reality that existed in sort of broad terms. And you did have the Scottish National Party as well. They were a much smaller party. A party that supported, obviously, the ultimate goal of Scottish independence. But they, in the kind of pre-2014 era, they were a presence, but not a significant presence. What happened, as you alluded to in your question, in 2014 was, of course, we had the referendum on Scottish independence. The Scottish nationalists had gained power in the Scottish Parliament in 2011. For some reasons that maybe we'll come to discuss, but that referendum in 2014 completely changed the dynamic of Scottish politics and completely changed the landscape, because you moved from having this very conventional political situation of left versus right to having one where people were motivated much more by their identity, and specifically their identity on the question of independence. And you had voters, their primary concern became not left versus right politics, but independence versus unionism, which is what we call the kind of pro Remain in the UK people in Scotland. So it completely shifted the dynamic, and this had a monumental impact on the Scottish political landscape over the last 10 years, definitely.
And when you mentioned the referendum, in that times, who initiated the referendum from the Scotland or Scottish politics or political parties?
Yeah, so it was a complex process. It had always been the policy of the Scottish National Party to support the ultimate goal of an independent Scotland. There were debates within the party throughout the 70s and 80s of what was the best path to get there, but on the whole, the Scottish National Party always supported that as an end goal. What happened is you had the creation of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. I think we'll go on to discuss a bit of this, but that had its own elections, and in 2011, the Scottish National Party won a majority in the Scottish Parliament, which was a very significant moment. The electoral system is such in the Scottish Parliament that you're not meant to be able to get a majority. You have to do extremely well for one party to win a majority outright. The system is designed to encourage sort of coalitions and a multi-party system. But under Alex Salmond, who was the then leader, the SNP did win the vote in 2011, and with a majority, they passed an act which called for a referendum. But crucially, the Scottish Parliament didn't then and still doesn't now have the power on its own to call a referendum. That's what's a reserved issue to the UK government. And so they required the permission of the UK government. And David Cameron, who was the Conservative UK Prime Minister at the time, decided that because the SNP had won this majority, that he would grant the permission in order for there to be an independence referendum. And I think with the intention that it would be a referendum that would be easily won for the pro-UK side. It turned out, I think, to be much closer than he had expected. And also that would then kind of put this question to bed for a generation or more, and potentially undermine the power of and the purpose of the Scottish National Party. So that was how it came about.
Right. So the Scottish National Party played the major role in that process because it has the majority in terms of the parliament. So can you tell us a bit more about the Scottish National Party? Because in the world, many people, when they say or when they see or read about National Party, it's automatically nationalism and that sort of movement. So what's the Scottish National Party like in Scotland? What sort of party is it?
Well, it has a fascinating history, and certainly in sort of contemporary terms now, I think certainly it would be defined as, or certainly its members, the majority of its members would perceive themselves as being very kind of centre-left, social democratic, not as you say in your question, kind of a traditional. Perhaps what people might assume is a traditional nationalist movement. For instance, they're very pro-immigration. They would like to think of Scotland as being an internationalist country. They're very pro international institutions like the EU and the United Nations, that kind of thing. So it's not a conventional nationalist movement in that sense. It does, in its history, it has had elements of that. So I mean, it was established as a single party in the 1930s, fusion of a kind of left wing party. And then a fusion of a sort of right wing, the National Party of Scotland, and they sort of merged together. They realised that they were better off if they wanted to achieve independence. They needed to work together rather than. And since then, that's kind of always been the SNP's sort of modus operandi. They've always had a broad tent, a broad church. Of support that's pulled in a lot of members from the left and also some from the right, who all are motivated by their desire to achieve Scottish independence. And that kind of almost goes beyond kind of conventional ideologies. But certainly today, yes, they would be a sort of a kind of centre-left, sort of, I suppose, liberal almost kind of party in their outlook. And one of the arguments that they would now make for independence is that actually it would enable Scotland to be a more outward-looking, a more internationalist, a more a cooperative power in Europe, for instance, than the UK. And this is particularly post-Brexit, obviously, you know, that argument has come to the fore. So it is different to other nationalist movements, which might be more have a different view of sort of international institutions and that kind of thing.
How would you describe the Scottish National Party popularity and understanding among older generation and younger generation? Because that's quite an issue that, you know, people are interested in.
Definitely. Well, the SNP has made huge inroads among the younger population. I think that particularly if you look at support for independence, it's much, much higher among younger people than it is among older people. And indeed, I think it's only when you start to get into the 50 plus, 55 plus age bracket that you get majority support for the UK. So it's an idea. Independence as a concept has gained huge traction among younger people, definitely. Of course, many people were in 2014. In 2014, it was the first contest kind of electoral experience that they had. In many ways, I thought it was quite a divisive campaign, but I know that a lot of people also found it very exciting and energetic, and it gave them a taste for politics that has followed through into their support the SNP, and the SNP has made specific overtures towards younger voters as well. So, for instance, they succeeded in lowering the voting age for the referendum to 16, which had a big impact. And there are a lot of people now who are coming through to vote for the first time, who've largely only known SNP dominance of Scottish politics. So there is very much an older versus younger generation divide when it comes to support for independence in particular, but also support for the SNP.
So, which choices do Scottish people have? We mentioned Scottish National Party as the major one, or the party which is the most popular. What else is at the moment in Scotland on the political scene?
So there are two other main parties other than the Scottish National Party. The first I mentioned is the Scottish Labour Party, which was, until the kind of late 2000s, was very much the dominant party of Scottish politics. It had been for about 30 years or more. It persistently won, the vast majority of seats in Scotland. When the Scottish Parliament was formed in 1999, it formed the first administration there, and would go on to do so for the next 3 elections. So it was very, very popular. Its support absolutely collapsed after the referendum in 2014. The Scottish Labour Party, I should say, is a pro-UK party, so it generally supports remaining in the union with the rest of the UK and opposes independence. Although some of its members, particularly more left-wing members, perhaps might be more pro-independence as well. So it can be slightly divided on that question, which doesn't help with voters understanding where it stands. But after 2014, its support completely collapsed, and even now, it's they had, I think, 40 MPs going into the 2015 general election, and after that general election, they had 1. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the collapse in support. And they're starting to make a bit of a recovery in Scotland now, which we're probably going to talk about, but still, it's very much not the dominant party it once was. The SNP has completely eclipsed it and taken away a lot of its support, largely for those issues I mentioned at the start. The other main party is the Scottish Conservative Party. The Scottish Conservative Party has a really interesting history, actually, because it was, and no one nowadays thinks of Scotland as being a conservative place. But actually, if you were to go back to the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, Scotland actually had a huge conservative support. In the 1955 general election, the Conservative Party won more than 50% of the vote in Scotland. And the only other party to do that throughout the entire electoral history of Scotland was the SNP in 2015. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the support that the party did have. But slowly over the decades that followed the kind of 1960s, the Conservative Party lost a significant amount of its support, particularly under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And by the kind of 1990s, 2000s, it was very much the third party really in Scotland. They only had a handful of seats at Westminster, and they were consistently the third party in the Scottish Parliament as well. That did change a bit again after 2014, going back to what we said at the start, because people started to identify as being pro-UK rather than left or right or anything like that. Because the debate became pro-UK versus pro-independence, the Scottish Conservatives were very much perceived as the UK party. And so they were able to take advantage of that. In the 2016 Holyrood election, they overtook Labour to go into second place. And they also did extremely well in the 2017 general election in Scotland as well. So they've enjoyed a bit of a resurgence, actually, as a result of this change in the political landscape. But perhaps their fortunes are starting to decline a bit now as well.
Do you also have any political parties which are, let's say, trendy, like green parties or people inclining to the climate change policies? Or do you have any emergence of liberal parties?
I was just thinking, actually, as I finished that answer, that I didn't mention the Scottish Green Party, which was a big oversight, because they're not a huge party in Scotland by any means, but they are a very significant party. As you say, I mean, their origins are very much in the devolution era, so post 1999. And they tend to get elected only on the proportional representation list system. So they don't do very well at general elections, whereas you'll know we have first past the post. It's harder for them to do well there. But I think they started out very much the kind of classic, as you'd expect, sort of environmentalist party. But they made the decision in the late 2000s to also support Scottish independence. So they are the other main kind of pro-independence party, along with being an environmentalist party. And today they actually sit alongside the SNP in a kind of it's not quite a coalition, but in a sort of they have a cooperation agreement. So they are an important party in Scottish politics for sure. There are also the Scottish Liberal Democrats, which is the Liberal Party. They had a number of seats, about I think certainly more than 10 seats in Scotland until 2015. Again, as a result of the 2014 referendum. They're a pro-UK party, and they got completely eclipsed by the SNP. They were very strong in the Highlands, but now they only have, or after 2015, they only had one seat at the general election. It's Orkney and Shetland, right in the Northern Isles of Scotland. But they remain that there's a portion of the country for sure that will still support the Liberal Democrats.
You mentioned several times Scottish Parliament.
Mm.
What does it mean for Scotland and for international relations? Because I think some people might be confused. There is a parliament as Westminster, as a UK, as a centre, making decision-making policies. And then there is Scottish Parliament. So why Scotland has that parliament, and what's the mission of it, or what's the political role of the Scottish Parliament?
Mm. Well, the origins of devolution go back an awful long way, even though it's a relatively it was an institution of the last 20 years or so. As far back as 1911, Winston Churchill was making an argument for a Scottish Parliament in cabinet. So these things have their origins in deep in history. The purpose, I suppose, of the Scottish Parliament is there's always been a sense that Scotland, as with other countries that make up the Union, Wales, Ireland, now Northern Ireland, they do have, as well as being part of the UK, they often have a distinct national identity or distinct attitudes towards local issues. And that there's a sense that decisions are often best taken by the people that affect them. And so that therefore it's a good idea, where possible, to kind of devolve power over certain issues from Westminster to regional assemblies or parliaments or whatever kind of language you want to wrap them in order that they can make those decisions on behalf of their people. And this is overtly as well, I think, a method of kind of keeping the union together. Obviously, in the 1920s, Ireland separated from the United Kingdom. There had before that been what was known as the Home Rule movement, which was to keep Ireland in the UK, but give Ireland a parliament that would have control over its kind of domestic affairs. And since then, I think there's a sense among some people that really value the union, that the way to keep countries like Scotland and Wales, and to the extent it's necessary, Northern Ireland within the UK, and maintains popular support for the union, is to give them as much control as possible over their own domestic affairs. So the Scottish Parliament came into being in 1999 as a result of a referendum that took place in 1997. Its powers have been expanded a bit over the last 20 years or so, but it effectively has control over issues like healthcare, policing and justice, transport, education, some aspects of economic policy, but not all. So it has quite a broad range of powers, and indeed it can, for instance, we'll talk about this probably when we talk about the economy, but it can set income tax rates. So Scotland now has different income tax rates to the rest of the UK. So it has quite considerable control over domestic politics in Scotland. But what it doesn't have control over is things like foreign policy, defence issues, international trade, immigration. these kind of things, which are the UK Parliament manages as a whole for the whole of the UK. So there's no divergence on policy in terms of those things. But it has created an interesting dynamic for sure.
Is there any movement or is there any campaign to make the Scottish Parliament even more effective and efficient, and to implement some of the competencies coming from the foreign policy or international relations? Because for some people it might be quite useful, you know, I want to invest in Scotland, I want to influence domestic politics and domestic economy, but in some way I have to start with London, not with Edinburgh. So I'm just like the contemporary movement or contemporary politicians. Maybe you have some political experts, maybe you have some political analysts, you know, commenting the issues. So are people happy what they have at the moment, or they would like to expand the competencies of the Scottish Parliament even more?
Well, it's a very good question, Martin. I think this is a very controversial subject in Scottish politics, as you might imagine. So I'll take it in two parts. In terms of what the Scottish government or the SNP do, I mean, they completely recognise, I think, that point, and so they have set up a number. I think it's about half a dozen now, kind of international offices. Obviously, they're not embassies, but they sort of conduct a shadow diplomacy. Makes it sound rather sinister, but they're there to represent the Scottish government, to engage with foreign governments, to engage with foreign businesses, to try and encourage investment in Scotland, and also to represent, I think, Scottish products and Scottish brands on the international stage. Obviously, you know, things like whiskey and that, you know, there are some iconic Scottish brands that the Scottish government is keen to promote abroad. So I think they definitely recognise that point, and I think that particularly post Brexit, the Scottish government is keen to have more control over its international affairs. The UK government, though, is very reluctant to do this, and indeed, it's been a controversy recently around the extent to which foreign office officials are being expected to facilitate kind of diplomacy by the Scottish government. So, for instance, these international trade offices will often use UK embassies and things abroad for meetings, where the Scottish government official might be advocating for independence, which of course is not a UK government policy, and trying to encourage support among the international community for independence, which runs contrary to the wishes of the UK government. So these things become very, very controversial. And, you know, if I were a Conservative politician speaking to you today, I would say, well, of course, the UK government advocates for the UK economy and for investment in the United Kingdom and for UK industry, of which Scotland is a key part. So you don't need, as the Scottish government, you don't need control over these areas. But of course, the SNP would see things differently.
So the communication between the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster at the moment, how would you assess this? You know, like do you have any like constructive dialogue, or it's all about clashes and disapprovements and who is stronger politically and who is stronger locally? So how is it at the moment?
It's interesting. I think if you go back to 1999, you know, the early period of the Scottish Parliament, it was much more cooperative because, of course, you had a Labour government in Westminster under Tony Blair, and then Gordon Brown, but particularly Tony Blair in this period, and then a Labour government in the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood, as we call it, which you know, I think naturally makes cooperation and dialogue much more straightforward. I also think in that period, of course, independence wasn't really or wasn't at all the kind of driving force of political discussion. And I think it has changed the dynamic, and it's slightly set the Scottish Parliament up as a sort of alternative or contrary institution to the Westminster Parliament. And so over time, they have come to clash a lot more, and the relationship is now a lot more confrontational. There's obviously a lot of other reasons for that as well around issues. I mean, Brexit being the primary one, but also personalities. I think that, for instance, the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, very, very different people, probably not going to see eye to eye in any circumstance. So the relationship has become a lot more controversial, and of course the clashes over having another independence referendum itself, something we haven't mentioned yet, but it's been a very hot topic over in Scottish politics over the last kind of 5 years or so, whether there should be another referendum. The UK government has repeatedly, and the House of Parliament has repeatedly refused to allow the SNP to have another referendum, to grant it the power, as they did previously, for there to be another referendum. So that obviously has caused a serious contentious as well. I think it will be very interesting to see what will happen. We expect a general election in the UK next year. The Labour government wins, and the Labour government is more, or Labour Party, sorry, is considered to be more respectful of devolution of the Scottish Parliament. The Labour government, of course, set up the Scottish Parliament in 1999. If that might change the dynamic slightly, and we might move back towards having, even though the SNP is still in power in the Scottish Parliament, maybe they'll have a more cooperative relationship, because there won't be such an ideological clash as you get between the SNP and the Conservatives. But certainly at the moment, I think it's not sort of working fluidly.
Right. It's not ideal, as we say in
Yes,
political
exactly.
correct English.
Yeah.
That's good. You mentioned the independence, Scottish independence as the main political movement. Can we say a few sentences about the impact of the Brexit on this movement? Was there any influence, or it was taken as, oh, there is Brexit, there's gonna be Scottish independence very soon?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was a huge huge moment in British politics, obviously, but in Scottish politics as well. And interestingly, and this goes back to talking about the character of the SNP, the SNP's policy has always been what they call independence in Europe. So they have always advocated, and even in 2014, they advocated that an independent Scotland would try and apply to rejoin the EU, or would, the aim would be for it to be an EU member state. And of course, some people make the argument, well, why are you taking power from Westminster to then hand it to Brussels? But that's a different argument. But I think it is certainly true that in recent years the SNP has been very pro European Union membership, as have a lot of people in Scotland. It was one of the key deciding factors in the 2014 referendum was Jose Manuel Barroso, who was then the president of the European Commission, indicating that Scotland, an independent Scotland, probably wouldn't get back into the EU. Was a key moment in the 2014 referendum campaign, because I think people in Scotland are very pro-EU. And that was borne out in the Brexit referendum itself, where the vast majority of people in Scotland voted to remain. It had the strongest Remain vote of any part of the UK. Only of the nations, I think only Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain. 62%, I think, of people in Scotland voted to remain. So very, very high compared to the UK average. But of course, the UK as a whole voted to leave. And this created a serious issue where the SNP argued that Scotland was being dragged out of the EU against its will, to use their language. And Nicola Sturgeon, who was First Minister at the time, decided that this was a material change in the circumstances from the 2014 referendum, and that therefore people in Scotland had the right to say if they wanted to be in a Scotland that would be part of a UK that's outside the EU. What is interesting is it hasn't actually led to a significant jump in Brexit hasn't actually led to a significant jump in support for Scottish independence, which you might have expected. While there have been some polls that have suggested there's now a majority for independence, most of them indicate that actually it's still split in the same way as it was in 2014, which is about 45% of the country support independence and about 55% of the country oppose. I mean, you see slightly different, but roughly it's the same within the margin of error. So I think Brexit clearly has had an impact in terms of the I suppose, the kind of the casus belli, or the legitimacy, the perceived legitimacy of a second independence referendum, but it hasn't actually moved the dial in terms of support for independence in the way that you might expect.
I tell you a few ideas from abroad that people are thinking about when you speak about Scottish independence. And most of them, they understand the pro arguments, why you want to be independent. But there is a group of people arguing with few points. The first one is Scotland as a reservoir of drinking water for the UK. The second one is the Scotland as a significant military base for the UK, because we have submarines and all those things around Scotland. And the last one is the geopolitical meaning of the Scottish territory, which has a strategic point in terms of the aircrafts, maritime security, and also the energy security, as Scotland is expanding renewable energies, and also there is the oil basically next to Scotland. So how would you respond to those arguments of the, let's say, skeptics of the Scottish independence?
In terms of the defence issues, they're absolutely right. I mean, Scotland is a hugely strategically important area for defence, and particularly in a world where we're in kind of renewed conflict or confrontation with Russia. Um, it's a key strategic point in terms of the North Atlantic, and it is, as you say in your question, it's a key strategic interest in terms of defence as well. Not just actually for Britain, although it is hugely important for Britain, but for the United States as well. I mean, Faslane, which is the naval base on the west coast of Scotland, is not just the base for the UK's nuclear deterrent, but also I think is used by a lot of US submarines in the Atlantic as well, that kind of thing. And they've invested. The United States has invested a lot in the Faslane base itself, so it's hugely hugely significant. And as you say as well, in the North Sea, oil and gas, energy security. This is a very hot topic at the moment, of course, not just internationally, but in domestic politics as well, is what to do about the North Sea. So I do think from a security point of view, that there would be clearly concerns, I think, about what independence might mean for not just for the security of the United Kingdom, but I think for the security of the NATO alliance. And I think this is particularly pointed because, of course, the Scottish National Party policy is that nuclear weapons must not be based in Scotland. They are very anti-nuclear weapons, and so no one knows quite what permutation that might take were Scottish independence actually to happen, and if they would force the UK to move its deterrent out of Faslane, or if they would lease them the base, or there are various options that are discussed. But the fundamental, and it is a kind of totemic issue for a lot of Scottish nationalists, is that nuclear weapons shouldn't be based in Scotland. So you could theoretically end up in a situation where the UK and indeed to an extent other NATO allies become quite strategically exposed should Scotland be independent.
Right. So let's assume that there is a referendum today and you say like 76% say, yes, we want to be independent. Then what? What do you guys need? Like, do you need a signature from Westminster, or that's it? Then you can work on the borders and the flag and anthem and everything? Or how does it work after the referendum?
Mm. Well, so Alex Salmond, who was the first minister the Scottish National Party leader who took part in the 2014 referendum, he argued that an independent Scotland could be set up within 18 months. So his plan was that kind of in 2016, I think, by 2016, Scotland would be able to break away from the United Kingdom. I think the experience of Brexit and the massive complications and time-consuming negotiations and difficulties and political logjams that we faced with that, I think, make such a timeline, 18 months, to set up an entirely new country, not probably seem a little unfeasible these days. So I think that would, in terms of the practicalities, that would definitely have to be revisited. I think the really important thing, though, from the perspective of Scottish nationalists, and if they want to make independence a success, is that it has to be recognised by the UK government. And in fairness to Nicola Sturgeon and the future, the current First Minister Humza Yousaf, who's also now the leader of the SNP, they recognise this, because if independence doesn't have the support and the recognition of the UK government, then it's not going to have any international legitimacy either. And so that's why securing a legal referendum for which only the UK government can grant permission has become such an important factor for the Scottish National Party, and why they're not willing to hold a kind of Catalan-style referendum, because they know that if they want to achieve this legitimacy, it has to be with the consent and I suppose, to an extent at least, support of the UK government, which can only come through a proper democratic mandate.
Would it be theoretically possible to organize the UK referendum about Scottish independence, where the whole UK would basically vote, and the question would be like, do you agree that Scotland should be independent, yes or no, and then you have the UK consent, basically, or this is not possible at all? Just theoretically.
It's theoretically, yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. I know I grew up in London, but my family is Scottish, and I remember speaking to my grandmother during 2014. Who lived in London at this time, but she's Scottish through and through, and spent her life in Scotland until she grew old. And she was very angry that she didn't have a vote in the 2014 referendum, because she felt that it was very much a question of her identity, whereas I, who had only moved to Scotland, 5 years before, did get a vote. And so she was very agitated about this, and kind of thought that same thing of why shouldn't it be a UK-wide vote? I think the issue with it being a UK-wide vote is, I'm not sure. I mean, at the moment, the UK government, or indeed, in effect, English taxpayers, subsidise a lot of public services and public spending in Scotland, because we have a transfer of wealth as a result of the union, and therefore I suppose there's a good chance the voters in England might say, well, actually, I'd rather keep the £2,000 per head extra that we send to Scotland, and have it spent down here, and you can, good luck on your own. So I don't know if it might affect the outcome in a different way, perhaps, that people might expect. But I think it's unlikely to. It's a good theoretical question, but I think it's probably unlikely to happen, given those issues. But also, I think now, given the precedent that we had in 2014, which was a Scotland-only vote, I think people were reluctant even to change the question and that kind of thing. So I think it would be a sort of mirror of that.
I have one pragmatic question for my students, international students, who are wondering, do Scottish people have Scottish citizenship or Scottish passport? Or they are like British and they have British passports? How is it?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, yeah. So they have, you have a UK, United Kingdom passport, and all the same documentation as you would if you were born in England or elsewhere in the UK. The only thing that would be different, I think, is that your place of birth could be Edinburgh or Glasgow, I would say, on the passport, but no, you would have everything the same, for better or worse.
Right. So in terms, there is some designers watching, you can design the next Scottish passport. That would be quite useful for Scotland to have. Let's move to leaders and leadership in politics. Few days ago, I was reading about Nicola Sturgeon, and she was arrested, then interrogated for some hours, then she was released, and then there were various statements about financing the politics and all that mess. So can we speak a little about the influence or impact of Nicola Sturgeon on the Scottish politics? And why is she in that sort of, very strange situation? Because usually after we have the main politician resign, there are a few articles and then basically a few interviews, and she or he is going to join some international think tank and having nice speeches around the world. And suddenly we see Nicola Sturgeon is, wandering around police station. So what's going on? And why is that?
Yes, it is a spectacular change of fortunes. I think to cover to first of all tell you a bit about Nicola and then deal with it. Sturgeon was elected in 1999 to the Scottish Parliament. She's been an absolute fixture of Scottish politics of the devolution era. She was Alex Salmond's deputy for a long time, and then took over from him when he stepped down after the defeat in the referendum campaign of 2014. And for a period, I think particularly around 2015, around the EU referendum, perhaps a bit longer, she was one of the most, if not the most formidable politicians in Britain, extremely highly regarded. She had incredible popularity ratings, not just in Scotland actually, but she was very popular in the whole of the UK, which is slightly counterintuitive given she's a Scottish nationalist. But she was a wonderful communicator, and I think particularly on Brexit, she became a kind of a real figurehead for pro-Remain supporters, because she was a very articulate and sort of no-nonsense advocate for Remain and for strong relations with the EU after the Brexit vote. So she has a lot of strengths there. Her time in office was perhaps, she won an awful lot of elections, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2019, 2021. That's a good and significant majorities among seats or significant numbers of seats at every election. So she was electorally very successful. I think her policy record in office is a bit more sketchy, more mixed. And I think that you saw when she resigned a few months ago now, she sort of struggled to list any real or substantive achievements, which I think for someone who was in office for almost a decade is quite a telling thing. In terms of the what's happened to her since leaving office, and I think it's I don't want to speculate, of course, but it's interesting that she chose to leave office and then about 3 or 4 weeks later was arrested. But there is an investigation that the police are investigating the Scottish National Party's finances. There is £600,000 or so was raised by pro-independence activists for the Scottish National Party, with the specific remit that that money would be used to fund a new referendum campaign. Since then, the latest SNP accounts show that that money's sort of been spent or disappeared or whatever. It's no longer on the accounting books. And this is even further complicated by the fact that Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Murrell, was the chief executive, the kind of chairman, the person in charge of the Scottish National Party. So there's a very close link between the two. And as a result of this investigation, he was first arrested, and their home, Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Murrell's home, was searched. Then Colin Beattie, who's a member of the Scottish Parliament, but also the SNP treasurer, he was arrested and questioned. And then finally, was it earlier this month, in June, Nicola Sturgeon was arrested and questioned. And I think the next stage will be, if the police do think there's been wrongdoing, and it should be noted very much that Nicola Sturgeon in particular has protested her innocence of any wrongdoing, but if they do find there to be wrongdoing, then if they'll be charged. So it's quite a spectacular fall of, to go from Bute House, which is the kind of Downing Street of Scotland, to a police interview room in a space of about a month is quite a fall from grace, almost regardless of the outcome, I think.
Can we assess some sort of political legacy of Nicola Sturgeon? Because at the moment, all the students, all the audience is just reading about the charges and criminal activities and money and how this all influence her career. But usually, one scandal can erase the whole track, all the good things and maybe less good things you made, during the political career. But if there is no, let's say, this criminal, issue at the moment, what would be the Nicola Sturgeon's political legacy?
Well, I think, as I said, I think she was very, very good. She was electorally very successful. She was a wonderful politician at winning elections. Um, but does that really form a legacy? I'm not sure it does, because it's what you do with election wins that matter. And I think, as I say, that her policy record is quite quite weak. And I think that there is now a sense that she actually failed really to seize the opportunities, perhaps that particularly Brexit presented, to really turn the dial in favour of Scottish independence. I mean, the focus of the SNP under Nicola Sturgeon's leadership was always about the technical question of the mechanism of how did the SNP secure another legal referendum. And therefore, she focused on, well, the SNP need to win majorities, we need to win elections, and if we do that, then the UK government will have no alternative but to give us the power to hold another referendum. What she didn't focus on was converting people to being pro-independence. And so, as I said earlier, the numbers in terms of those that support the UK and those that support independence have remained pretty static between 2014 and now. And there maybe has been some churn underneath, but the headline figures are the same. And that, I think, fundamentally is the issue, and that is why I think Nicola Sturgeon will be viewed overall as a failure, because actually, rather, the issue wasn't the mechanism of how you gain another referendum. The issue was that not enough people in Scotland wanted another referendum, and not enough people in Scotland wanted independence. And she failed to persuade people of that case, and therefore, I think history will probably view her leadership, despite her enormous qualities as a leader and despite her huge electoral successes, as a failure.
Some international students also told me that from their perspective of being non-Scottish living in Scotland, that Nicola Sturgeon focused too much on independence, on the gender issues policies, and on sort of like, balancing the Westminster and Edinburgh in some sophisticated way. But then those people said to me a few things, like, for instance, there is a strike of bin people in Dundee or Edinburgh, so they're not collecting the trash. And they said, like, why are we not sorting the practical issues in Scotland? For instance, I spoke with some people who are fishermen, and they also told me, like, it's not how it used to be in Scotland. Something must change because we are losing that sort of Scottish identity, things we are doing in Scotland in our way. How would you assess, the criticism coming from those people?
I think there's a lot of fairness in that criticism. I think that the primary motivator of the Scottish National Party is independence, and therefore that means that when it's dealing with other policies, with practical policies, with the day-to-day elements of governing, Nicola Sturgeon in particular was very reluctant to rock the boat in any kind of way and do anything, make any kind of bold or significant changes to the way things were run, because it might risk alienating people from supporting the SNP or supporting independence. And so it was very much, her policy was very much kind of steady as she goes, more of the same, without looking to instigate any kind of reform or do things differently, really. And when you look at the practical consequences of that, the NHS in Scotland, I think, is in a pretty poor state. I mean, the National Health Service I think that could be the case across the whole of the UK, but Scotland, the NHS is run in Scotland by the Scottish government, and it could be therefore better. I think that education, Nicola Sturgeon promised to close the attainment gap between rich children and poorer children. It got wider under her government. There are really significant issues in their legacy, and I think that's right. But there is also a point, and we'll maybe come to discuss this a bit later in more detail, but throughout the time of the Scottish Parliament, this isn't just an issue with Nicola Sturgeon. Throughout the history of the Scottish Parliament since 1999, it has tended to focus more on social issues than it has on economic policy or kind of what you might call hard politics. It's preferred to wrestle with sort of softer issues, and I think there is increasingly a reckoning in among the kind of Scottish political establishment and the media, and that Scotland needs to start thinking about actually the sort of hard business of governing a bit more, rather than feel good sort of social policies that are, of course, have a place and are important, but can't be the only focus of a parliament and a government.
Right. The new First Minister of Scotland comes from my favorite area, Broughty Ferry, and he is Humza Yousaf.
Yeah.
And if you want to know something more about Humza Yousaf, I recommend to watch Indian TV, because Humza Yousaf and Rishi Sunak, that's basically, daily topic, because one is coming from the Indian origin, the second one is coming from Pakistani origin, So it's very interesting to watch that international discussion, who is who and what is expected from both of them. So Humza Yousaf and Scotland, what do you expect from his leadership? And when you said that there is election coming, does it mean that his mandate is only for 1 year, or for how many years? How does it work?
So in terms of Humza Yousaf's really interesting. When Nicola Sturgeon resigned, I don't think anyone, or many people, expected Humza Yousaf to be the person who would take over. He's a long-serving. He was first elected in 2011 and has been a long-serving minister, but his reputation for competence has not been strong. But nevertheless, he has held some very significant portfolios like justice, healthcare. So he has a lot of experience, even if necessarily he hasn't managed them so well. He won the succession to Nicola Sturgeon by promising basically to be the continuity Sturgeon, the successor to Sturgeon's legacy, and to pursue basically more of the same. Which is something that he's stuck with. I think the interesting thing about Humza is I don't really know why he wanted to be First Minister. I'm not really sure why. I think he saw a good opportunity, probably his only opportunity, and took it. But I'm not sure what his vision is for the role, and how he wants to take Scotland forward. And I think you've seen that a little bit in his first few months, I suppose we're coming up to his first 100 days almost now. There's no kind of sense of, okay, Scotland's at point A and I'm going to take it to point B. And I'm not sure that he, in his heart, in his self, quite knows yet what he wants to do with the office. In terms of his his mandate, so he was elected leader of the SNP, and therefore First Minister. The Scottish Parliament election isn't until 2026, so he's got a few more years, 3 more years, I guess, for that to run. But what we are expecting is a general election for Westminster, so for the UK Parliament as a whole, in sometime next year. It basically has to be probably autumn, I would think. And the SNP currently hold a significant number of seats, 44 seats, I think, in Scotland, in the UK Parliament. The question is if the SNP lose a lot of those seats, as seems likely on current opinion polls, the Scottish Labour Party is starting to catch up again with the SNP. And if the SNP lose a lot of those seats at a general election, can Humza Yousaf survive? He only narrowly won on second preferences, with about 52% of the vote on second preferences. He only narrowly won the leadership. He's not that popular. There are some people in the parliamentary party who don't like him. His main leadership candidate chose to leave the government rather than work with him. His main leadership rival, sorry, chose to leave the cabinet rather than work under him. So it could be interesting, I think, if the SNP do badly at a general election, he may be forced out, and they may decide to replace him with someone else who could do a better job. So be interesting to see what happens there.
And do you have any other political leaders who might aspire for being a first minister, or maybe, sort of like new generation coming after Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf, or
Yeah.
what sort of stage is the Scottish politics in the leadership?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think so. The first person I'd mention actually is in the SNP as well, and is a woman called Kate Forbes, who is early 30s. She's a very impressive, competent woman. She was the Finance and Economy Secretary until last year, or possibly 2 years ago now, when she left to go on maternity leave to have a baby. She came back from maternity leave to contest the leadership, and as I say, she was narrowly defeated by Humza Yousaf. But I think it would definitely be fair to say that her campaign excited a lot of people. And to go back to what we mentioned earlier when we were talking about some of the policy issues that we might have in Scotland, she's someone, I mean, she's a former City of London economist. She's someone who's very focused on the economy, on how to grow the economy, how to support business. She was very popular among business leaders when she was in the finance and economy role. And I think there was a sense that she might have provided a bit of a shift in terms of the focus of the Scottish Parliament, which might have been a good, refreshing thing. And I think she really has her popularity, curiously, has only actually gone up since she was defeated. So I think if Humza Yousaf were to be ousted, or to decide to resign after a difficult election, something like that, then Kate Forbes would be well positioned to take over the leadership from him. In terms of the other parties, the Scottish Labour Party also has a very good kind of up and coming leader, Anas Sarwar. Interestingly, Anas and Humza Yousaf actually went to the same school. They were classmates in the same secondary school, which is shows you what a small world Scotland is. But Anas's father was a prominent Scottish Labour MP in Glasgow. Anas was a Labour MP until he was defeated in 2015, and is now in the Scottish Parliament and is leader. And I think is a very charismatic, very articulate leader who certainly has good popularity ratings among the Scottish public. Of course, at this stage, it's quite easy to be popular because there's not much of a policy debate. He hasn't risked irritating anyone yet or anything. But I certainly think he could well be, after the next Scottish election, the next First Minister. Is perfectly possible. So those are the two that I'd highlight. Douglas Ross, who's the Conservative Party leader, and also sits concurrently as an MP and an MSP, so he's got a busy time. And is a good in his own way. He very much appeals to the Conservative faithful, but I would perhaps question how much he could reach out to non-natural Conservative voters.
Let's jump to speak a little bit about international relations. The first question is energy security and new energy projects in Scotland.
Well, I think so. Obviously, we mentioned the Green Party earlier, who are now in a cooperation agreement with the SNP, and I think certainly environmentalism and particularly responding to the climate crisis has become a really important issue in Scottish politics. Obviously, we had COP26 in Glasgow 2 years ago now, I think, and that really, I think, put the issue on the map in the mind of Scottish voters. I'll take the North Sea first and then think about renewable energy. In terms of the North Sea, there is now a presumption against oil and gas, I think it's fair to say. The Scottish National Party used to be historically very, very in favour of developing the North Sea, developing oil and gas in the North Sea. In the 1970s, they had the slogan, "It's Scotland's oil." And certainly when we were looking at 2014 and the independence referendum, the economic case for independence was very much built on tax revenues from oil and gas. So it's quite remarkable that has completely changed, and Nicola Sturgeon was instrumental in changing that. So that the Scottish National Party now it doesn't want to see the North Sea industry completely closed, but it doesn't want to see its life extended beyond what's necessary. It's now much more focused on renewable energy. The same is the case for the Labour Party as well, which recently, just this week, actually said that it wasn't going to grant any new licenses for oil and gas exploitation in the North Sea. So I think that there is a trend, I suppose, against the North Sea that I don't think is likely to change really, and I think that will probably have consequences for Britain's energy, or may well have consequences for Britain's energy security going forwards, because we're not in a position where we can scale up the renewables necessary in the time that we have, I think, to fill that that gap in domestic supply. But you're absolutely right that Scotland is also a hub for renewables, and that's very much the focus, not just of the Scottish government, but also the UK government wants to invest very heavily in renewable energy in Scotland, and there's a great deal of appetite for that. I think the issue is, and the concern among kind of industry leaders is that there isn't the financial commitment to do it at the scale that is and speed that is necessary. I think particularly when you look at countries, like the US with the IRA, or indeed the EU with their response, I think there is a feeling that Britain and Scotland in particular might be getting left behind in this race to support net zero, and so that does make it a topic in domestic politics, and I suppose one that would filter through into the international arena a bit as well.
Right. And do you see international investment activities in Scotland in terms of energy? I mean, in Edinburgh, do you see the meetings, the real people coming to Scotland with the real money and real projects? How is that?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of that, but I think, as I said, I think the sense is there could be a lot more. I think that the issue that we've had is there's been a lack of consistency, I think, in policy, economic policy generally, actually, but in net zero already, which has made Scotland perhaps a less attractive place for people to invest in some of these technologies and some of these schemes, particularly when you're dealing with things like planning and that kind of thing. I mean, the Scottish government is better about those issues, I think, than you would find in England. I mean, so for instance, the Scottish government has control over kind of big infrastructure planning projects, so it can overrule local concerns about the placement of wind farms and that kind of thing. And they actually got into a big row in 2012 with Donald Trump. I don't know if you followed that at all, about when they built a wind farm off the coast of his golf course, and he was very agitated about that. Yeah. But anyway, so I think there is scope there. I mean, there is definitely investment in renewables in Scotland for sure, but I think there could be a lot more if there were more consistent.
Can you say your opinion on what should be done about it? Like, what do you need to make it better?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think that obviously a lot of the technology exists, but implementing it is costly. And I think so. We need government support packages for subsidies and incentives to help get some of these technologies up and running, and to help encourage business investment in them. To give you, and that's a dual responsibility, I think, between the UK and the Scottish government. To give you an example, I mean, obviously with the North Sea, there's a huge potential for carbon capture and storage, CCS. And there are a number of sites, I think, in the northeast of Scotland, particularly at Peterhead, where that technology could be implemented, but it hasn't yet got off the ground because the UK government has delayed the necessary investment in it, the necessary funding round for it. So I think some changes like that could make quite a big difference without too much, without being too onerous. I do also think there's a skills issue as well, particularly in Scotland. Actually, I think obviously we have a great expertise in energy in the North Sea, but I think there's more that government could do to probably help people transfer those skills and reskill in those areas to support things like offshore wind. and green energy. So those are two things, I think. I think there's also possibly some financial reforms that could be made. Again, probably at a UK level, issues like Solvency II, the amount that insurance companies can invest in infrastructure projects. I think things like that as well could help unlock a lot of money to support from private investors to support green energy. So,
how would you assess the Scottish international economic diplomacy? Do you have any special programs, or how does it work?
yeah, so there is a program called I think it's called Global Scot or Global Scot, which is a kind of business ambassador program, which encourages kind of entrepreneurs and business leaders to go out and advocate for Scottish business and Scotland's economy around the world. I think there's a lot of criticism of that scheme, I think, as being not very effective, and it possibly could do with being refreshed. I think clearly Scotland, it's a small country, but I think it probably does punch above its weight in terms of the cultural and sort of the sort of cultural recognition it has. I think particularly if you think about trying to attract investment from a country like America, well, there are a lot of people in America who would claim sort of Scottish heritage, who would have a great interest in Scotland, and I think that really does help in terms of attracting investment. So yeah, I think there is an effort that goes on to make inroads in sort of attracting international economic investment, but there probably is more that can be done.
The next international issue that the world is observing and analyzing in the UK is immigration. We heard a lot about immigration policies and new laws and new regulations coming from the UK. But what we don't know if this problem or issue is as serious in Scotland as in London, I mean England.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's a really interesting question in terms of Scotland. Immigration is obviously, as you know, and your students will know, is a very contentious issue in UK politics. But actually, in terms of Scotland, it's quite interesting because all of the main political parties in Scotland are pro-immigration and want more immigration to Scotland. Scotland has a serious demographic problem of a declining population in general, but it also has a large number of areas that are increasingly depopulated. So I'm thinking of the kind of Highlands and Islands regions of Scotland, where it's very, very difficult to get people to move. It's very, very difficult to hire people for jobs, and this becomes a vicious sort of circle, as you'll know, and you see really steep declines in these places. So there is a political consensus, I think, it's fair to say, in Scotland, that Scotland needs immigration. The issue is that immigration policy is reserved to the UK and is treated. The UK is treated as a whole, and what you can't have is regional immigration. At the moment, what you can't have is regional immigration policies. Now, that may change. I think particularly if a Labour government comes in, there may be scope to encourage regional immigration, particularly around perhaps specific skills, but also just in general. And actually, there was a recent study. I can't remember which think tank it was, but looked at how it might work. And for instance, you can issue people when they come to the UK you'll be issued with a national insurance number, which is kind of your the number that you need in life to get on with just about anything, to get a driving license or rent a house or get a job. And once you've got your national insurance number, but you can code a national insurance number in a way that would mean that you would only be able to find employment in Scotland. So, for instance, that's an idea of how you could have a regional immigration system. You could adjust and offer visas only for Scotland, and that kind of thing. So, yes, it's a very important issue in Scotland. I think there is a consensus in Scottish politics that in favour of immigration, which is unusual in terms of UK politics. But at the moment, it's unlikely to change just because of the position in the UK as a whole.
The last issue I want to speak about in today's interview is a less discussed topic of poverty in Scotland, because not many people know that Scotland is presented as a progressive, modern country with all the high-tech technologies and like beautiful landscape and everything is all right. But then you go to statistics, and for instance, when I was at the University of St. Andrew, which is located in the region called Fife, almost 65% of people living there, they have a minimum salary. So it's quite poor region in terms of the real income. And when I read about Scotland as a whole, so I discovered that I think around 60 or 58% of people are in the same situation. So the poverty is sort of hidden topic in the Scotland, but when you speak especially with the young people who want some sort of future, some sort of employment and income, this is obvious issue. So how can Scotland use international relations, maybe diaspora abroad, to tackle the poverty issue in Scotland?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to highlight it, and I think the way you framed the question is very good, because there is this perception that Scotland is this kind of progressive country, and I think as a result, among politicians and the political establishment, there perhaps is a bit of complacency about some of these issues, and a sense that because they say the right things, that somehow that makes things go away. Obviously, that isn't the case. And I think it's done a lot of some of these things have done real reputational damage to Scotland abroad. The figure that always sticks in my mind is the deaths from drug abuse, which are the highest, I think, in the Western world, and have really skyrocketed in recent years. I think last year it was about 1,200 people or something died as a result of drug deaths. So, and by sort of proportion of population, that's higher, I think, even than the United States or something. Something I can't remember, but it's pretty bad. So these things are reputationally damaging. I think in terms of working with the international community, I certainly think that attracting investment obviously is key. I think that also we were speaking earlier about universities and the loss of Erasmus and that kind of thing. I think trying to make sure that we have vibrant research, that we have opportunities for young people, that Scotland isn't closed off from the world is really, really important. But I do also think as well, you're right, there's probably a role for the diaspora. I think that advocating for Scotland abroad is really important. Advocating for Scottish industries abroad is really important. And encouraging Scottish exports and that kind of thing is hugely important. But I do think as well, the domestic politics has a huge, the majority of the issues to face there, and I think particularly education and healthcare, the lowering life expectancy, for instance, that we have in Scotland, that's a really shocking thing, and that is the Scottish government's responsibility. And whether it's mismanagement or whether it's a failure to make the right long-term health decisions, whatever the policy issue might be, I think we really do need to work on that, because, as you say, I think it's a scandal, really, actually.
Andrew, thank you very much for your insights, your honest opinions about many issues. And this episode was fascinating because we learned so much about Scotland. And as you can see, one of the main characteristics of Scotland is honesty. And this is what I experience with people, with the Scottish professors, lecturers, people are willing to speak about issues, positive and negatives. And I think Scotland has potential for the bright future. But in some way, I hope that you will fix the internal politics, which is a crucial element for the stable, for the progressive international relations. Andrew, thank you very much again for being with us, and all the best for your career, for your great books. I hope that you will write the third one, and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate it. It was great to join you. So thank you for having me.
See you next time.
Thank you.